QSO Today, episode 457, Firth G3MFJ. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. My puppy is sad from the lack of subscriber and donor activity this week. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSO Today webpage. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo had a pleasant 6-show run since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. I believe that it's run its course. However, it is morphing into the QSO Today Academy, less of a convention and more of a ham radio presentation event coming on September 9th and 10th. I will be sending out more information in an email this week about the Academy. QSO Today sponsors are automatically members of the QSO Today Academy, with full access to the weekend and content generated from it. Another reason for becoming a QSO Today sponsor. We had some health emergencies in the family over the last few weeks, also while I was traveling in the USA, that are now resolving, making it impossible for me to conduct new QSO Today interviews. I hope to be back on track very soon. However, I am graced with hundreds of very interesting interviews in the QSO Today archive that on the rerun are fascinating. I had a wonderful interview with Firth G3MFJ of the G-QRP group and Sprat magazine fame back in June of 2016. Graham has been a ham over 60 years, loves QRP, building radios, and playing a mean bass guitar. I remastered the audio, making this QSO Today with G3MFJ more enjoyable. G3MFJ, this is Eric 4Z1UG. Are you there, Graham?
Yes, I'm fine. G3MFJ here, yes. Nice to meet you.
Graham, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
It started, my hobby really is electronics rather than just ham radio. And I had been interested in electronics ever since I can remember. And people used to give my parents old radios and say, Graham will like to play with these old radios. And I used to play with them. And on one occasion I don't know what I was doing, but I found Top Band. And I heard amateurs for the first time. And I must have been about 11, I suppose, something like that. And I was listening to these amateurs and I thought, that's something I want to do. So I made inquiries and I found that the school I was going to had a radio club, which I didn't know at the time. And so I went to this radio club and there I met G3KEP, who became my mentor in the early days of when I was 11, 12, no, probably 13, 14, something like that.
That was some years ago. Do you remember G3KEP's name?
David. He's now G4DMP because he wanted his initials as his call sign. David Pratt is his name. And his time we are still close friends. We'd see each other 2 or 3 times a year. But he became my mentor and he was setting up classes to pass the radio amateurs exam. In those days, it was a 8 out of 12 question theory examination, of which 2 or 3 of the questions were compulsory because they concerned the license condition. And the rest of them were theory, and they involved things like drawing an IF stage or drawing a BFO stage or drawing the circuit of a VFO. Or the lineup of a simple transmitter. And he mentored us, there was about 6 of us, through the radio amateurs examination, and I passed mine in May 1957. I was 15.
Where exactly was this, and what was the name of the school?
Right. Well, I was born in Shipley, which is a small town in Yorkshire, in West Yorkshire. And then we moved when I was a child, just at the end of the war, 1945, to Bradford, also in Yorkshire. After the various primary schools and so on, I ended up at what is now Bradford Grammar School. It was Bradford Grammar School then. And I went there in 1954, 52, I think. 52, 53.
Just for clarification, in the United States, grammar school implies kindergarten through sixth grade. And are you saying that in England it implies later grades?
They start at age 11. At the end of your end of year, I don't know what they call years now, but when you were 11, you took an examination in those days, which was called the 11 plus, and that was an examination to decide how clever you were and which school you should go to. And the majority of people went to normal secondary schools, but I shouldn't say this really, but I passed of a sufficiently high standard to go to this grammar school, and the grammar school was essentially a private school in that most of the parents paid fees for the children to attend. But I got awarded a scholarship there, which meant that my parents didn't, and in fact couldn't have ever paid the fees for it.
Schools like this were the tracks to colleges and universities.
Oh, yes, that was the intention. Yes, it was to get people to universities and so on. I never had any ambition to go to university. I wanted to go out and work. So I treated it effectively as a normal secondary school, and I left at age 16.
Okay, you got your first license in May of 67.
I got my only license in May of I passed the examination in May of 1957. And in those days, there was a compulsory Morse examination, which was 12 words a minute, receiving and sending both numbers and letters. There actually were two separate exams for numbers and letters. And I took that in November 1957. And that involved travelling to a nearby government communication, maritime communication centre. And we lived about 60 miles from the coast, and I had to travel to Hull on the train with my father because I was obviously still only 15, and attended the Coast Guard station in Hull, where we sat, and I did the Morse test, passed that, and then got the licence in December 1957. And it's the same licence I've had ever since. We don't change call signs in the UK. Well, we didn't then. You got a licence and that was it. It was yours for life.
We were talking yesterday about when we were setting up this interview, and you told me that in those days there was only one class of license in England.
There was only one class of licence. It was an amateur radio licence, and that was it. In years to come, they brought out a Class B licence, which was for VHF upwards, and that didn't involve Morse, but it was the same theory examination. If you force me to a date, I would say in the 1970s, something like that.
The examination you're talking about was not multiple choice like we have now, was it?
Oh, no.
You said that you had to have 8 out of 12 questions to pass. That meant that these questions were longhand or drawings or something like that.
Yeah, you were writing text, essays, things like that. Please explain why you should use a low-pass filter on the output of your transmitter. Questions like that, and you had to write an epistle on that.
So to study for that exam, you had to have a broader understanding of electronics and radio to be able to answer the questions?
No, there are some banker-type questions in that you could bank on there being something about a receiver, maybe the lineup of a receiver, a superhet, or a particular section, a drawing of the IF stage or the detector stage, questions on a transmitter, questions on aerials, and the first 4 questions of the 12 were about license conditions, and you had to answer 2, maybe 3 of those. And there were the conditions of the licence, what you had to do, what precautions you had to take, so on. Don't connect your aerial to your transmitter 350 volts line, sort of thing.
For example?
For example, yes. But yes, you could bank on questions on aerials, receivers, transmitters, but never what the question was going to be, no.
Do you remember what your first rig was after that?
Oh, yes. Yes, I remember my first radio with the receiver was an XRAF receiver, one that was used in the bombers that went over to Germany. It was an R1155, which was a receiver that they as I say, was in bombers. The transmitter was homemade. I couldn't afford it. I was a schoolboy. I couldn't afford it. So with help from David and the other members of the radio club, we all built our own transmitters. And mine was a 6V6 PA, which anybody of any age will remember the 6V6 very well. And a couple of RF pentodes in front and a 6V6 modulator. And it was built on a metal chassis, which was recovered from a radio, and it had a hardboard front panel. Hardboard is compressed fibre board. Not very stable, but it was the best I could afford. It was the only thing I could do metal work with, without doing metal.
Do you have any pictures of that from those days? We all wish we did, don't we?
Well, we all wish we did, don't we? You see, nowadays you would take hundreds of digital photographs and they'd still be there. I don't know. I may be able to look and find some. I will have a go. I have a feeling I might know where there might be a photograph of the whole station. But it was top band, of course, because that was the novice band, not novice, but that was the band all beginners used to use. 80 metres was.
What did you say, 160 meters?
160 metres, yeah. 1.8 to 2 megacycles. We didn't have megahertz in those days either.
So you were out in the country and you had room for a 160 meter antenna?
I was very lucky. When I first started at school, we lived in a house with a fairly small back garden, and I just strung a length of wire out that would fit the garden. But when I got to 16, my parents moved house. And we moved house to a house which had a 300-foot long back garden. So for a top band man, that was manna from heaven, was that. My interest in top band was always CW. We were limited to 10 watts input to the PA stage. That was the legal limit for top band. You couldn't use any more power. And I admit we maybe squeezed 11 watts out, but we never did any more than that. And I worked all over Europe. I worked in America a couple of times, all on CW, all using 10 watts. And that would be in the late 50s, early 60s.
How would you describe that experience, building that transmitter and working the world?
Oh, magic. Absolute magic it was. As I said, before I did that, I used to build a lot of things, amplifiers and various things like that, radios using valves and so on. I used a TRF, a regen receiver, one valve for a long time as a kid, and but to build a transmitter and actually talk with it was wonderful. It was not very stable, I'm afraid, but it worked. But the rest of the lads I was at school with also were in the same boat, and we all built these fairly unstable radios. But yeah, it was fun. We did that, and I did that for a number of years. And as I got a job, I went to work for the National Communication Company, the GPO telephones, as was. I didn't want a radio occupation. I wanted something that was electronics allied, but I didn't want to go to a radio occupation like repairing radios or designing radios or anything like that. Radio was my hobby.
So this was your avocation, not your vocation.
Yeah.
And that's the way you like to keep it.
Oh, yes. I my hobby is still electronics in all various forms, and I still do a little bit of amateur radio.
From your biography, it appears that you retired from the telephone company over 20 years ago.
I did indeed. I retired in 1992. I was very lucky. They were getting rid of staff, and they came along and said, if we make you redundant and give you all this money, will you retire? And anybody would have been a fool not to accept it, so I did. And then I went to work part-time for another communications company. But this time it was a company that was in telephones, in telephony, like the GPO or British Telecoms is now one. But it was council-owned by the City Council. It was the only one in the United Kingdom. It's in Hull. Interestingly, where I went for my Morse test in 1957. But they had their own telephone company and were, as I say, were unique. Everybody had red telephone boxes except Hull, who had white telephone boxes, just to show the difference. And the company was run by the City Council, and they provided telephone services. And part of the job that I had before I retired, I met a guy who lived in Hull, and we became very friendly. He had an electronics interest like me. And when I retired, he said, would you like to come and work part-time for us? And I said, yeah. And I ended up training for a number of years. Towards the end of my British Telecom career, I was a lecturer at their training school, and therefore was a fully qualified lecturer. They needed somebody who was a fully qualified lecturer to train customers on how to operate these telephone type systems they made. You know, these things where you ring somebody up and it says to speak to Jim, press 1, to speak to George, press 2, to speak to Fred, press 3. Well, they wrote the software for that and provided the hardware, which was obviously computers. And then when it was installed and working, I went along and spent a day or two with the customer teaching them how to write all the program for it. So to operate it, put the words George and so on.
We'd call that an automated attendant, right?
It is, that's right. It wasn't in those. I mean, we're talking now in the mid to late 1990s. There was nobody else offering this sort of thing then. They were the first. Needless to say, since then, of course, there's now hundreds of companies operating this automated attendant system. But they were among the first. And I spent a happy 5-10 years part-time working. They ring up one day and say, can you go see this company next week, Tuesday and Wednesday? And off I went, and I loved it. It was great. It was. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
You now have an encore position. Maybe it's more fun than money, but you're in the theatre now, right?
Yes, I do. Yes, it's back to the electronics part, really. I'm sorry it's drifting away from amateur radio, but...
No, we'll drift back. Don't worry.
Okay. Well, there was I live in a village which is about 7 miles north of Leeds, and I was friendly with lots of people, and somebody said to me one day, we're interested in starting a drama group. Are you interested? I said, well, I'm certainly not going to go on stage, but I'm interested in doing backstage. And it led to lots of things, but eventually it ended up in me designing and building a stage lighting system for them, which is, interestingly enough, still there and still working. And I designed and built this stage lighting system and installed it, and it was a very successful drama group. Unfortunately, like everything now, we all got too old, and the younger people don't seem as interested. And that's obviously something that worries us in the amateur radio field, really. I go to these hamfests, and in general, I am the average age of everybody there. And I first heard that said by a Roy Llewellyn, W7EL, who is a good friend of mine. And he said, I have gone to hamfests since I was a child and been the same average age every time. And it's true. There are less younger people coming in now than there used to. Can I go to the G-QRP club? Or have we finished with drama?
I'm also involved in drama and musical theater here in Israel.
Oh, yeah?
I find the same thing. We're all getting old, and we've got to find different hooks to pull children into theater and amateur radio.
They are indeed, yeah.
They don't get the magic yet.
No, you're right. It is that. It's
They're born with a cell phone in their hand, and they don't have to know how it works.
They, well, they are. My son, you see, who is now 30 something, and I've said to him over the years, "Are you interested?" No, I said, I can pick my phone up and talk to anybody I want to all over the world. Although he did for a short time be interested in PSK. I got him interested in that because that was digital. It wasn't talking. And he got a little bit interested in that. But now he is a high-powered man in the digital networking field and is not at all interested in amateur radio at all. I'm having to put labels on things which are valuable because when I go eventually, his mother, my wife, will say to him, "Will you do something with your father's shed?" and he will just tip it all into the landfill. And I've got to label to him that what's worth money shouldn't be thrown away.
Yeah, I think we're all faced with this at a certain point.
Yeah.
We know how valuable it is, but our spouses and our families think we're junk collectors.
Yes, I have a lot of junk, I have.
Before we move on to the meat of our discussion, I noticed that you have a number of American call signs. Why do people in Britain, or why do hams in Britain have a number of American call signs?
I am W3MFJ, which is almost the same as G3MFJ, of course. And that is a... what do you there's a word for it.
A vanity call sign.
That's the word, vanity call sign, yes. Funnily, it's interesting. I went to a hamfest a lot of years ago, in the early 1990s, I guess, and local one. And there is a big place run by the Americans, although perhaps I shouldn't say that, here at Menwith Hill. And that's fairly close to where we live, and it's run by the NSA, and there are a lot of Americans live there on the site. But they also go to the radio clubs, and they offer this radio club at their hamfest, or a rally as we call them, "Would you like us to run an American license class?" Because they were all VEs. And the radio club said, "Oh, that's a good idea." So I arrived there, saw this, and I thought, a challenge. So I went in and they said, "Which license would you want?" I said, "What are the various levels of license?" And they told me. And I said, "Well, can we start halfway up?" No, you've got to start at the bottom. So I started at the bottom and I passed whatever was a novice license, then the next license, and then the next one, and passed the associated Morse, because there was a Morse test. And I came out with a general license. And I was KC7LLX, believe it or not. A 7 because I went to school with a guy who was a radio amateur. He was one of these people I've mentioned that we did it at school with. And he moved to and lived near Seattle. He lived in Washington State. He did. He lived in Vancouver, Washington State.
Oh, you needed an American address.
I needed an American address, and he was the only American at that time that I knew. So I said, "Can I host my call sign at your house?" And he said, "Yeah, no problem." We were still in contact. And so that's why I was a 7. Then I decided that I would want to go further. So in 1995, I think it was, I went to Dayton for the first time. And I went with a friend of mine, Tony, G4WIF, Whiskey India Fox, of which I'll talk more about him later because he's got me into all sorts of things. But we went to Dayton, and I discovered at Dayton that you could also do American licenses. And I thought, well, I don't want to be a general, I want to be the best. So we enrolled for him and I, and he started at the beginning because he didn't have an American license at all. And we went and sat there and did exam after exam, spent the whole day at this school near Dayton. And he got all the way up to, what's the one before extra?
Well, it's general advanced.
Advanced, yes. He got all the way to advanced in one session. And I got from general to extra in the one session. And then I was AB7VN, which was a nice call because it was the same forwards and backwards in Morse. But anyway, I decided that once the vanity calls came along, I ought to have the W3MFJ. So that's why I've got 3 call signs. Have I used them? Yes, I have. I have been to America probably about 15 or 16 times since then. A lot of them with the aforementioned Tony. And we've operated there using 2 meters or HF bands as we could in amongst the various things we went to.
When in America, you have to use your American license, not your English license or your British license.
Well, I can, you see. I could be W7/G3MFJ because they are signatories to the same thing. I think it's or is it G3MFJ/W7?
Oh, I understand. Because you're not an American citizen, you don't have to use your American license when you're in America. But I am an American citizen. When I travel to the United States, I have to use my United States license and call sign.
Yeah. No, I can use the UK call sign stroke. I think it's either W7 stroke or stroke W7. But now I don't have to do that. I have my own license. It's not a thing I use a lot, obviously. But as I say, I have been there a number of times. I met Tony in the late 1980s when I became very involved in a new telephone system based on computers. I'm back with the British Telecom now, and we met because he also was involved in this telephone system, and we became friends, and we are still friends. We're still very close friends now, but we became very friendly. And in the early days, he realised that I was a low power operator, and I have never operated anything bigger than about 70 watts. But I spent what operating I did was low power. And he said you ought to join the G-QRP club, which I'd never heard of. And so, in fact, he paid for me a year's membership with the G-QRP club.
You have an Ozark Khan biography that says that you have always operated all modes, but that operation is always QRP.
Yes, I have.
Tony recognizes this, and that's why he invited you to the G-QRP club. So why operate QRP? Everyone wants to operate 100 watts on a wire.
No. I have a 100-watt transmitter. I admit it. It sat out there in my shack, but it spends all its life down at 5 watts. I went QRP in the early days because of television, because I lived in a fairly hard spot for television. And the moment that you ran any power of any sort, you wipe the televisions around for the whole district. QRP's easy. You use 5 watts, even less. And nobody has any trouble with that.
And you can still be successful making contacts.
Oh, yes, I can hear now. Well, in those days, when I had the 300-foot garden, I had a 260-foot top band half wave, and I could work all over Europe on less than 10 watts. No problems at all, and didn't interfere with any televisions.
And when we're defining QRP, we're meaning that CW is 5 watts and that single sideband is 10 or 15?
It's 10 watts for SSB and 5 watts for CW, yes. But the essence of it really is it's not a thing where, a large bomb will drop on you if you use 6 watts. It's the essence of you use 5 watts. If you can't get hold of the guy and you need to talk to him or you want to talk to him, wind the power up a bit. There's nothing wrong with that at all. And as I say, I have a 100-watt rig, but it hardly ever goes above 5 watts. What bit of use it gets, I'm afraid I'm not a big operator.
And now this mid-show break. You can keep the QSO Today podcast commercial sponsor-free by becoming a listener sponsor yourself. For $10 a month, or save 20% at $100 per year, you can become a listener sponsor. I'm now recording the QSO Today podcast as video interviews that are available only as a benefit to listener sponsors through our QSOTodayCommunity.com website. As I develop the sponsorship tier, I will add bonus content for listener sponsors. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo has now evolved into the QSO Today Academy. QSO Today podcast sponsors are automatically members of the QSO Today Academy and will have full access to the Academy resources under construction now. The benefit of listener sponsorship as an alternative to commercial sponsorship is that commercial sponsors influence the content and comments in the podcast. Commercial-free allows a greater degree of freedom to discuss any ham radio subject without commercial consequence. I have eliminated all commercials in the QSO Today podcast from episode 445 on, with the exception of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, as I think it is a serious asset to a well-rounded ham radio education. I'm not using Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon anymore, but my own system for managing the community that could form out of the podcast. I direct you to the sponsorship section of the show notes pages beginning with episode 444, where I list all of the contributors to the podcast since 2014, including sponsors, donors, and hams who have paid for the transcriptions. There is a new section where I list the most recent sponsors and donors over the last 30 days. This list is generated automatically from my membership system. Sadly, there were no new listener sponsors or donations to the QSO Today podcast this last week. Our funding model is now value for value, where you trade with me your time, talent, or treasure that you think values the benefit of the QSO Today podcast to you. If sponsorship is not your interest, then you can make any size donation to the podcast by clicking on the donation button on the QSO Today podcast website at qsotoday.com. There is a slider that you can use to adjust the amount of your donation. If you want to make your donation monthly, click on the recurring donation box. It is the recurring donations that keep the lights burning here. I want to thank everyone who has contributed and will contribute to my effort to create this oral history of amateur radio since 2014. It will eventually all be in the public domain for hams in the future to enjoy. Be sure to become a listener sponsor or make a donation today. And now back to our QSO Today. So your love for QRP began with your need to avoid television interference?
It did indeed, yeah.
What keeps it going now?
The challenge, yeah. Anybody can go out and buy a kilowatt, 2 kilowatts, and talk to everybody they want to talk to. But it's easy. I'm not talking about the incredibly difficult places, but in general, with 1,000 watts or 2,000 watts, you can talk to whoever you want to talk to. And these guys use the 2,000 watts, whether it's the opposite side of the world or the opposite side of town. And it's for no green reasons. It's just that it seems very pointless using high power. It's a lot harder to do and more challenging and more fun doing it with low power. And ARRL eventually came in, and they now offer a DXCC for QRP.
When you make a contact or call CQ on QRP, do you announce that you're operating QRP?
I announce what my power is, because you tend to do that, don't you, on a CW contact, power here, 5 watts. But I don't make a big thing of it. It's just the power I use.
Do you use DX clusters to help you get contacts?
No, I have never used a DX cluster at all. I don't do a great deal of operating. I'm still the electronics constructor. But as part of the QRP ethics, George Dobbs, G3RJV, who I believe you're going to talk to in the future, he started the G-QRP club about 40 years ago, and it's still going, and the membership is still increasing slowly, but increasing nevertheless. And George and I decided that there ought to be something to encourage A, building, and B, QRP. So we used one of his designs for a simple receiver, a direct conversion receiver, which we produced as a kit, and has been incredibly successful, and we've sold about 500 of them over the years, and we still produce. And they were the circuitry was designed by George. I tidied it up a little bit so that the components were easy to get, or I could get them in quantities. And then we met up with Rex, W1REX, who lives in Limerick, Maine, and he is QRPME, and he does radios in tuner tins. You may have heard of him.
As a matter of fact, Rex will be our guest next week.
Ah, wonderful. Well, Rex is the greatest guy here. But he said, I can do printed circuit boards. You send me all the information and I will create the printed circuit boards for you. So he produced the print. Oh, he didn't produce them. He designed them and then had them made, and they are delivered to him. And then they come over here in penny numbers because that's easier than any other way. It just means his system is he gets all the printed circuit boards.
So the Limerick receiver then is your design and Rex's product?
It's George's circuit. It was called the Sudden because at that time George lived in a little section of Rochdale called Sudden. So this radio was called the Sudden radio. Since Rex got involved, we added the Limerick to it, so it's now the Limerick Sudden range. And the first one we produced was a simple direct conversion receiver. It's probably been going 10 years now, I think. After that, we then went to the transmitter, and we now do a Limerick Sudden transmitter, which is about 2 watts, something like that. And I have had a tremendous fun using these two here and working all over Europe on CW with. And then we finished the lineup about 3-4 years ago with the Z-Match ATU. So the 3 little boxes sat side by side, and it creates a complete station, single band. Each of the modules is a single band. We sell most for 40 meters. There are loads of them in America. We must have sold 50, 60, 70 in America. And we are a rival to Rex because he produces QRP transmitters and receivers. But we do it a little bit different, that's all.
There's a surprising number of manufacturers that are making QRP transceivers, which implies that there's a market for them, and there are operators that want to get into QRP or get into ham radio inexpensively?
That's right. Yes, that's right. Well, Rex was one of the early ones. There was obviously Dave, the SWL range, Wonder Labs, small Wonder Labs. He produced them, didn't he?
And then there's the NorCal.
There's NorCal. They produced them as well. But we were all around about the same time producing these things because people seem to suddenly want to start building. There are a lot of people who will go and spend what I consider to be monopoly money for these radios. You know, people quote £10,000 for a radio. I just can't see figures like that. What, $15,000 for a radio? But we can produce these kits for, well, not pennies, but our radios are about $50, something like that. But for your $50, you get a radio in a box and it looks good. And you can take the lid off and show it to your friends and relatives and say, look, that's a shortwave radio.
So, Graham, if you were starting on QRP and all of the radios like the Tuna Tins and the Limerick radios are single band, which band would you start on?
Well, in the UK, out at 40 metres. And in fact, interestingly enough, the ones we sell to America are all 40 metres. There's a little bit of interest in 30 metres, a little bit of interest in 20 metres, but we do an 80-metre version, but nobody ever buys one. 40 metres is the one I would recommend. And from here, in the middle of right in the middle of England, really, 200 miles north of London, I can, with my modified G5RV, which is a 100-foot long centre-fed antenna, I can work all over Europe with that. No problem. On CW.
Yeah, and 40 meters is a nice band for after work, an evening kind of band.
Yeah, it's a lovely band, it is. It's the 20 metres tends to be used more by people chasing long distance. Talking long distance is interesting, but I'm quite happy on 40 metres to talk all over Europe. It's no problems. And as I say, my aerial's only 102 feet long, and it's not fed with the G5RV system. It's fed with open wire feeder, which goes straight into the back of the Sudden ATU, and it works fine.
You are a co-author of a book with your friend Tony, Simple Test Equipment for the QRPer.
I am indeed, yes. Yeah, we saw a hole in the market when Tony and I started going to Dayton, in fact, with George in the early 90s. And we saw talking to people at the 4 Days in May event precedes or does at the same time as the as that Dayton Hamvention, talking to people and they're saying, yeah, I can build this, but how do I test it? And there seemed to be a big hole that nobody could build test equipment. So Tony and I put our heads together and we came up with this book, which made test equipment a lot easier. I have to say it's a lot better now because the radio magazines and places like the Banggood Chinese place, they produce test equipment now, but nobody did in those days. And we started preaching the gospel effectively in that we went to Atlanticon, Ozarkon, Archicon, that was another one, the Californian one that I can't think of at the moment, the NorCal one in California, we went to that one. And people invited us and said, will you do a talk on simple test equipment? So we did. And it was very successful. It was. As I say, other people have seen the hole in the market now, and people are producing simple test equipment. Notwithstanding people like the Four Square Club, they produce simple.
So, Graham, from this book, what test equipment should the QRPer have in his ham radio workbench?
You obviously need a meter. That's the first thing, and you can now buy a digital meter from Harbour Freight for next to nothing. You couldn't in the early days. But things like an RF probe, where very simple, you can actually prove whether RF is there or not. A crystal oscillator, a crystal tester, simple things like that nobody seemed to encourage people to build. They were all saying, oh yes, go out and build this radio, but if it doesn't work, you're on your own. And we felt that there was a hole there. And this book, which is way out of print now, we sold a lot of copies, all printed in my dining room where I'm sat at the moment. They were all printed and bound in my dining room. And we sold it for a small amount. And lots of people built RF probes, simple signal generators, attenuators so that they could see how well the radio was working. Test oscillators. I can't think of anything else.
Do you think that the book is still relevant?
It's less relevant now than it used to be at the time.
I guess what I'm thinking is, could you turn it into an electronic book and put it on Amazon?
Well, we did think of that, but then we looked at it and thought, well, there's a lot of work needs doing because you can get a lot of stuff simple. We, in the early days, for example, suggested that people went out and bought a computer speaker, a loudspeaker amplifier, and used that for testing because there was no way you could buy simple amplifiers in those days. So we suggested people bought the computer speaker and used that.
Like as a signal tracer?
Yeah, that's right. And put an RF probe in front of it and you can detect audio. You can detect radio signals all through to the speaker. So it's still relevant, but I don't think it's as relevant as it was. We did talk about turning it into an Amazon book or a Kindle book. I think, honestly and truthfully, time got in the way.
What's on your workbench right now that you're building?
Would you believe it's something to do with stage lighting?
Of course.
It's it's a unit that the local Methodist Church wants so that they can switch on lighting, and it's two little radio control modules that came from China through eBay, and I have got input and output main electric sockets on them so that people can turn on the lights as and when they want them from a handheld remote control. That's the current thing that's on the bench.
What is the amateur radio project that's burning a hole in your bench that you want to do?
Do you know, I would like to build a regen receiver. I've built a number over the years. One of the things that we do in the G-QRP club is we have a build-a-thon every year. We've been doing it for about 6-7 years now. And last year, George designed a regen receiver, which we then turned into a kit. And that's done by a company called Kanga UK. And they produce the kit and they now sell it. And it's a regen receiver, obviously covering a single band. What I would like to do is build a regen receiver with a converter in front of it, such that the regen is actually tuned to a single frequency, like an IF detector, and then put a front end in front of it, which converts all the frequency bands, tunable to this single IF. That's my next project. And it has been my next project for a little while, but things keep getting in the way.
What is the Sputnik 80-meter transceiver? I found it. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, it was somebody discovered that you could still buy the valves, tubes that the Russians used in the original Sputnik it was the 50s, wasn't
Late
it?
50s.
I remember my father taking me outside and saying, "Look, that's the Sputnik up there," and we turned the radio on, and there it was going beep, beep, beep. But yeah, somebody discovered these valves were still available, and it was Rainey, Michael Rainey.
Yeah.
AA1 something.
That was AA1TJ. He was a guest on one of our earlier podcasts.
Well, he discovered you could get these, and he bought a lot of them. He bought them in bulk and distributed them. He sent some to George, and it was a challenge to build one. And mine sits there, and it operates lovely on 21.06, which is as close to the Sputnik frequency that we can get, because that was on 20 megs, wasn't it? So that it was easy to find by WWV and so on. But it works fine. It gives out about half a watt, and I've had quite a few contacts with it. And they were built all over. Joss in northern Belgium, he built one that I know of. I know Michael Rainey built one, and a number of other people built one. It was a challenge, and it was done by my memory goes, I'm afraid, the Russian man who invented 72 as the QRP equivalent of 73. I can't think of his name now.
I can't either, but I'll look him up.
Yeah, well, he invented 72, Oleg, and he came to America at one point and came to 4 Days in May. That wasn't a year I went, but he discovered these, and he has a Sputnik Day every year, or a Sputnik weekend, and we all go on and try and have a few contacts on 2106, because, as I say, nearest frequency, and it's the QRP calling channel.
Now, how did you build that? It wasn't Manhattan style, and it wasn't dead bug style. It was a style that I used also as a kid, but I don't know the name of it.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. We're going to Rex again, because Rex produces these Me squares, which are 0.2-inch squares. It's a board of 300 of them, all routed so that they will split up into pieces, and that's what I built mine with. You glue them down. I don't know what it's called. We call
I think that's the Manhattan method.
It's like Manhattan, isn't it? Yes, it is. I've built like that for years. In my early days, I built 2-meter converters in a tobacco tin. And that's lovely because you can solder direct to it, or the connections hang in the air. Well, that's how I built that Sputnik transmitter. It's using Manhattan techniques, using Rex's squares.
Okay, so what I saw when I saw the pictures of building the Sputnik, I saw a technique that I used as a kid where I used a small hole saw and a drill press to drill the pads.
Oh, yeah, we've done that as well. That's another one. That was invented by George N1APB in New Jersey. George, I can't think of his second name.
Right, so he uses two sizes, but one of my Elmers when I was a kid taught me to use one size. I think it's about 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch to make the round pads using a small drill press.
That's right. Well, we still sell those, the pad cutters. In fact, Rex gets them from a local jewellery store, believe it or not. And these create a small circle in there by drilling around it. So you end up with effectively what's like a hole in the copper.
Yes, it's a little bit dirtier way to build than gluing the pads down.
That's right, it is. You do need a very stable drill press, because if you don't have a very stable drill press, you make some very pretty patterns, which are absolutely useless because the drill will wander all over them. And as I say, you get a lot of patterns, but it's a good technique. It works very well. I tended to use the me-squares because, as I say, being very friendly with Rex, we sell them with the G-QRP Club. One of the things I do for the G-QRP Club is sell hard-to-get parts. I buy parts in large quantities and sell them to members very cheap. And we buy all this stuff, these squares from Rex, and sell them as well.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. Do you have an online store?
No, we don't, because it's for club members only. If I had an online store, we'd get everybody buying.
Then you'd have a business.
I'd have a business. I don't want a business. I'm quite happy to get parts and sell them to club members, and we sell them for minimum profits, just enough to keep the club going. Membership of the club is £6 for a UK member, which is about $10. It's more for America and DX because, of course, of the postage. But they get a good magazine 4 times a year, and I'm on the back of every issue with all the parts that I have available for club members. But no, I don't want to.
And that magazine's called Sprat.
Called Sprat, indeed. And George will tell you all about that. He's been editing Sprat for 40 years.
We'll leave that for George. You received the Don Cameron Award from the USGB in 2015. What is the Don Cameron Award?
It's a NorCal 20 transceiver that's been painted gold and engraved and so on, and it's presented for services to QRP. And my services to QRP that year was to provide the parts that I provide and encourage home construction. That's it, really.
Well, that's pretty cool.
I was honoured to receive it. George actually got an award at the same time. He got the Calcutta Key, which is a much more prestigious award than the Don Cameron Award. And we went down together to London to be awarded.
You are also in the ARCI QRP Hall of Fame.
I am indeed, but that's back to test equipment.
That's from the test equipment.
Tony and I were inducted into that in the same year. I now can't remember when it was, but we spent a lot of time coming across to America and going round and preaching the gospel. I mean, we did a lot of it in this country as well, but we preached the gospel that test equipment doesn't have to be frightening. It doesn't have to be spectrum analyzer. In fact, Tony designed a circuit for a very simple spectrum analyzer, which used a crystal set circuit, believe it or not, and it worked. And you could draw on, you needed an oscilloscope, of course, but Tony produced this simple spectrum analyzer using hardly any parts. And it worked. It was amazing. And that was also in our test equipment book.
That sounds great. Do you suppose that spectrum analyzer is somewhere online?
Do you know? I've no idea.
We could find out and put that in the show notes page.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll have a look. I don't know whether it's still available or not, but it was in one of the magazines. I think it was in Practical Wireless, which is a UK amateur book.
Well, we'll see if we can find that and put that in the show notes page.
Yeah, but that was one of Tony's, and it was in the book, and that really was it was effectively an absorption wave meter, but it tuned a range of frequencies all at the same time with an oscilloscope display. That's what it basically was.
You have other talents as well, it's my understanding. You're a bass guitar player, and you're active in a local band. Does having other passions keep your amateur radio hobby in perspective?
I am an avid player. I have played bass all over. There used to be always a picking and grinning session at all the US Hamfests, and I usually managed to catch somebody to lend me an instrument to play. But yes, I do like playing bass guitar. I am a frustrated lead guitar player. In my formative years, I played a lead guitar in a local band, and then, like lots of things, children came along, and my wife and I have 4 children, and that caused a break in most things, amateur radio and music and everything. And now I've got a bit of arthritis in my fingers, and I can't cope with a lead guitar like I used. So I play bass guitar, which I love. And I was in a local band. Unfortunately, that's got defunct because the guy who organised, that is the players who only wanted to play music, he died. He dropped dead on his front doorstep, unfortunately. But he was the guy who organised charity events, booked the band to play there, and then organised all the rehearsals. I want you all at the rehearsal hall next Wednesday, sort of thing. But when Mike died, it just destroyed the band really, because we'd no incentive. So that did the band. But yeah, I've played music all my life. I think music and CW go together.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I think you'll find that people who do music find CW a lot easier than people who don't do music.
One of my buddies and former guest on the podcast is Wayne Burdick, N6KR, of Elecraft fame, an avid CW operator from the very beginning of his ham radio career. And even from that time, he was a guitar player and composer. Do you think that there is some correlation between music and CW operator?
I think it does. I'm not a composer, but I do like to play music. I can't read music at all. Music to me is just a line of telegraph wires with birds on it. I can't read it. I just I hear a tune and I can play it. It's just instinctive. I don't know how it happens.
Wow. One of the most frequent messages I get from QSO Today listeners is that they don't have time for amateur radio. How do you overcome this challenge?
Well, I spend less time doing amateur radio now than I used to do. And I put that down to my time involved with the G-QRP club. We run this convention every year in October at a place called Rishworth, which is a small town in between Yorkshire and Lancashire in the north of England. I'm the main organiser of that, except that I don't do the book the traders. We have somebody else does that. I spend a lot of time doing that. I spend a lot of time doing the sales, the club sales. That takes quite a bit of my time up. I spend a bit of time doing the electronics bit. As I say, I'm building this lighting thing at the moment. As I said right at the beginning, my hobby is electronics with amateur radio being a part of it, as opposed to amateur radio with being electronics being a part of it. It's the other way around. And so it's just one thing. So I have the most activity I've done has been over the past few years designing and building these sudden kits and also repairing them. If anybody has any problems, we offer a send it back to me and I'll fix it situation. And then I go on the air with one of those and have half a dozen contacts into Europe on CW. And that's probably most of my amateur radio activity nowadays.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
Join a club. There are radio clubs all over the place. I'm afraid, like everything else, they are aging members. But I went to a Hamfest on Sunday, which was the opposite side of the country from me on the west coast. And they were all radio amateurs. And if you want to get into amateur radio, find a local club. If you want to, after that, then join another club. I'm biased towards the G-QRP club because we are interested in low power and for people to build their own equipment. it does involve them being on CW. At the moment that I know of, I don't think there are many, if hardly any, SSB home-built radios. I know Farhanded, which was built, but it's complicated, you see, isn't it? It's not simple. Our transmitter is 4 transistors, and the receiver we have is a couple of ICs, which are easy. But as soon as you move into something like sideband, I think George and I's ambition is to produce a sideband transmitter, but it's going to involve a lot of work, and we haven't got that far yet. But if you speak to George, you can ask him, does he have ambitions to produce a sideband radio? And I'm sure he'll say yes and tell you what he thinks.
We talked a little bit earlier about getting youngsters into the hobby. Have you thought about what the hook might be to get youngsters into the hobby?
The hook seems to be, we've supplied, there's a group who does Build-A-thon, much about 200 miles further south and west of me, and we've supplied them with radios. They seem to be able to get youngsters in. There is a convention coming, I believe, next year, where they're bringing youngsters in from all over Europe, and part of that will be build your own something. The regen receiver we designed for last year's convention has been very successful. The Kanga people have sold quite a number of them, and that's an easy way in. It's buildable by yourself, and at the end of the building session, which doesn't have to be long, we built these in an hour and a half, something like that, you have a working radio. You can tune it round and hear things. And I think that's the hook. The other hook, the Radio Society of Great Britain, which is our equivalent of the AIIL, for their centenary year, produced a centenary receiver, which was PSK, and that was very successful, and they produced a kit for that. And that's a good hook, because people can say, oh, look, I can connect my computer to that. And that works well, getting them in from that point of view. But I don't know any more than that. I think that it is harder. People were queuing up to be radio amateurs when I started, after I'd started. But I don't know how you hook them in nowadays, other than by getting them to build something.
Right, and seeing that they can actually produce a sound from something that they built.
Yeah, that's right. The other big thing, of course, was Tim Peake in the space station. He talked to schools all over the UK and the rest of the world, I assume. But he was very good for amateur radio, because his contacts were all made using amateur radio. And they talked to school. There was a local school just down the road from here in Otley. They had a contact with Tim Peake and the Otley Radio Club, which is my local radio club. They set it all up for them. And the kids thought it was wonderful, talking to the space station on amateur radio.
As it's flying overhead.
As it's flying overhead, yeah.
Well, Graham, you didn't think you'd be such a terrific guest on the QSO Today podcast.
Well, thank you.
The truth is, I had to coax you into coming on today.
Yes, you did, I'm afraid. I thought
that you're such a good friend of George's. In fact, George was supposed to interview with me yesterday, and he came to your house, and we just couldn't make it work.
No, it didn't.
I'm glad that we made this work today, and we'll get a hold of George and get him on in the future.
Yeah.
And in another day or two, we'll have him on the QSO Today podcast.
That sounds wonderful. And you're going to talk to Rex, and Rex, as I say, is a great guy.
I've already talked to Rex, and Rex is in the sequence after you.
Oh, okay.
And he was also a lot of fun. And I just want the listeners to know that we have such a great time doing these interviews and having these conversations with the hams. So, Graham, this was very enjoyable for me. I want to thank you very much and wish you 73.
Thank you. That's very kind of you, and 73 to you too.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Graham. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in G3MFJ in the search box at the top of the page. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing on the subscribe buttons on the show notes page. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Your value for value support is recognized on the QSO Today podcast and in the weekly show notes. Use our Amazon link when you shop on Amazon. Clicking on this link before you enter Amazon will allow Amazon to pay us a small commission on what you purchase. This is a very painless way to support the QSO Today podcast. QSO Today is syndicated on every podcast platform, including Spotify and the iTunes Store. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.